Welcome to Softly Curious. Take a moment to settle and let your breathing slow. Nothing here requires effort, and it's fine if the words simply pass by. You don't need to hold every idea, because the story continues whether you are fully awake or gently drifting. Tonight, we return to a time before games followed us everywhere, before screens lived in our pockets or waited silently in our homes. This is a time when games stayed in one place and people moved toward them. Arcade games did not appear suddenly. They emerged slowly at the edge of other ideas, borrowing parts of older worlds and reshaping them into something new. Long before video screens became common, people were already familiar with the idea of paying a small amount to interact with a machine. Pinball tables, mechanical amusements, and coin-operated devices had existed for decades. They lived in bars, amusement halls, seaside promenades, and stations where time needed to be filled. These machines were not quiet companions. They were physical, noisy, and unapologetically public. What changed in the late 20th century was not the desire to play, but the nature of the machine itself. When screens entered these spaces, they did not arrive as neutral displays. They arrived as glowing surfaces capable of movement, reaction, and memory. For the first time, a machine could respond differently depending on what the player did. This was not yet about storytelling, characters, or worlds. It was about interaction, about cause and effect happening instantly, under bright lights while others watched. Early arcade games were shaped as much by limitation as by imagination. Hardware was expensive, fragile, and constrained. Memory was scarce. Graphics were abstract, not by choice, but by necessity. And yet, these limitations produced a clarity that would define arcade design for decades. Shapes had to be readable at a glance. Motion had to communicate danger or safety without explanation. Sound had to cut through ambient noise and remain meaningful, even when overheard rather than focused on. The earliest screen-based arcade experiments appeared in the early 1970s. These machines were not designed with long-term engagement in mind. They were designed to be understood quickly, played briefly, and repeated often. This was not a flaw. It was the core of the idea. Arcade games were not meant to occupy an entire evening. They were meant to fit into the gaps of daily life, to capture attention, release it, and then invite it back again. One of the most important shifts happened when games began to move away from novelty and toward repeatability. Early machines demonstrated that people would pay not just to try something new, but to return again and again, improving slightly each time. This insight reshaped everything. Difficulty became deliberate. Failure became expected. Success became temporary. The machine did not promise completion. It promised another attempt. Behind these decisions were people who understood both technology and behavior. Some came from engineering backgrounds, others from entertainment, others from pure curiosity. What united them was a shared understanding that arcade games were not private experiences. They were performances. Every play session happened under observation, even when no one spoke. The machine faced outward. The screen was visible from a distance. Sound announced progress and failure to the room. This outward orientation mattered. It meant that arcade games were designed not only for the player, but for everyone nearby. A single game could gather a small audience, turning individual input into collective tension. This was one of the quiet innovations of arcade culture, the idea that watching could be as engaging as playing. Games were short enough to observe fully, yet complex enough to reward attention. As these machines spread, certain patterns solidified. Cabinets grew taller, drawing the eye upward. Screens angled slightly back, inviting a stance rather than a seat. Controls became robust, designed to endure thousands of repeated actions. The physicality of arcade games was not incidental. It reinforced the idea that play required effort, posture, and presence. You did not relax into an arcade game. You leaned into it. By the late 1970s, arcade games began to coalesce into a recognizable form. What had once been isolated experiments now shared a common language. Movement became smoother. Feedback became clearer. Scores appeared prominently, turning each session into a measurable performance. This was also the moment when competition entered the space, not through direct confrontation, but through persistence. High-score tables transformed anonymous play into lasting traces. 3 letters could linger long after the player had left. Certain games accelerated this transformation dramatically. When alien formations marched downward in synchronized patterns, when simple characters navigated enclosed spaces, when repetition gave way to rhythm, arcades filled faster than ever before. These games did not explain themselves. They did not pause. They assumed the player would learn by doing, or by watching someone else fail first. This assumption became a defining trait of arcade design. At the same time, arcade games began to travel. They crossed borders quickly, carried by cabinets that required no translation. Instructions were minimal or absent. Meaning lived in motion, sound, and consequence. This universality allowed arcade culture to develop differently in different regions while retaining a shared core. In some places, arcades became loud social hubs. In others, they became quieter, almost meditative spaces where attention narrowed rather than scattered. In Japan, arcade games integrated seamlessly into dense urban environments. They appeared near train stations, under elevated tracks, and inside multi-level buildings. The rhythm of city life aligned naturally with short, intense play sessions. In the United States, arcades often clustered in malls and entertainment centers, becoming destinations rather than interludes. These differences mattered, but the underlying structure remained the same. Brief engagement, high focus, immediate feedback. Throughout this period, arcade games resisted complexity in the traditional sense. There were no long narratives, no elaborate explanations, no gradual tutorials. Instead, complexity emerged from repetition. What seemed simple at first revealed depth only through sustained attention. This design philosophy rewarded patience without demanding commitment. You could walk away at any moment, yet still feel pulled to return. Economics reinforced these choices. Arcade games had to earn their space. Each machine needed to justify its footprint and maintenance. This pressure encouraged designs that were reliable, replayable, and difficult to exhaust. A game that could be mastered completely would fail quickly. A game that remained slightly out of reach could survive for years. Difficulty, in this context, was not cruelty. It was sustainability. By the early 1980s, arcade games had reached a form of maturity. The rules were understood, even if they were never written down. Players knew what to expect when they approached a cabinet. Designers knew how to guide behavior without words. Owners knew which machines would attract attention and which would fade into the background. Arcade games were no longer experiments. They were a system. Yet even at this peak, something fragile lay beneath the surface. The same qualities that made arcade games powerful also made them vulnerable. Their dependence on physical space, public attention, and specialized hardware tied them to specific economic and cultural conditions. As technology continued to evolve, these conditions would shift. But at this moment in time, arcade games represented a precise balance between machine and human, between difficulty and desire, between solitude and spectacle. They asked very little and offered just enough: a coin, a stance, a few minutes of focus, and in return, a brief sense of control inside a brightly lit machine. As this balance held, arcade games defined an era, not because they were the only way to play, but because they shaped how play was understood. They taught players to accept failure as part of progress. They taught designers to communicate without explanation. They taught spaces to hum with shared attention. And as the machines multiplied and the rooms filled, the focus quietly began to shift from where arcade games came from, toward what they were doing to the people standing in front of them, toward how these machines were not just entertaining players, but training them, preparing their hands, eyes, and instincts for a particular kind of interaction that would soon extend far beyond the arcade floor. During this early period, the cabinet itself became an important communicator. The artwork on the sides, the shape of the frame, even the height of the screen were designed to signal what kind of experience waited inside. Bright colors suggested urgency. Darker tones suggested challenge. Without words, players learned to read these signals before ever inserting a coin. Another shift occurred when sound began to serve more than a decorative role. Early arcade machines used audio sparingly, but designers soon realized that sound could guide behavior. A rising tone could signal danger, a brief melody could reward success, and a sharp noise could announce failure to the entire room. These sounds were not only for the player, they were for everyone nearby, quietly advertising what was happening on screen. As arcades filled with more machines, competition for attention intensified. Games needed to be legible not just to the person playing, but to someone passing by at a distance. This pushed designers toward clear silhouettes, exaggerated motion, and repeating patterns that could be understood even with a quick glance. Complexity was hidden beneath simplicity, revealed only through time and repetition. The idea of fairness also took on a unique meaning in these spaces. Arcade games were not designed to be fair in the traditional sense. Instead, they were consistent. The rules did not change, even when they felt harsh. This consistency created a strange trust between player and machine. Losing felt personal, but it also felt earned, because the game had not changed its terms. By the late 1970s, a shared understanding had formed among players. Without instruction manuals or tutorials, people learned by observing hands, timing, and posture. Knowledge moved quietly from person to person, often without conversation. A slight pause before pressing a button, a controlled movement rather than a frantic one, became part of an unspoken vocabulary. This period also marked the rise of rhythm as a defining element. Many arcade games were not just about reaction, but about timing. Enemies moved in patterns, hazards followed cycles, and success depended on syncing movement with the machine's internal pace. Players who resisted this rhythm struggled, while those who adapted seemed almost calm, even under pressure. As arcade culture spread internationally, local differences began to appear without altering the core experience. Some regions favored faster games, others leaned toward precision. Yet the structure remained recognizable everywhere. A coin, a brief challenge, a score left behind. This consistency allowed arcade games to feel both local and universal at the same time. The machines themselves aged quickly. New technology made older cabinets feel slow or limited, even if their designs remained solid. This created a constant push forward, where innovation was expected rather than optional. Designers were not just competing with other games, but with the memory of what players had already experienced. By the early 1980s, arcade games were no longer experiments or curiosities. Their shapes, sounds, and rhythms had settled into something recognizable, repeated from room to room, city to city. A person approaching a cabinet already knew what kind of commitment was being asked, even before the screen came alive. Arcade games were built around a very specific kind of experience, one that revealed itself only through play. There were no introductions, no explanations waiting at the beginning. A screen would light up, a sound would signal readiness, and the game would begin immediately. This directness was not accidental. Arcade games assumed that the player would learn by doing, not by reading or being told what to expect. Across different titles and different eras, a shared structure appeared. Games started quickly, often within seconds of inserting a coin. There was no long preparation phase, no gradual build-up. The player was placed directly into motion. From the first moment, something demanded attention. Enemies moved, spaces filled, timers counted down. Arcade games did not ease into difficulty. They presented a situation and allowed the player to respond. This immediacy shaped how arcade games were perceived. They felt dense, compact, and focused. Each moment mattered because there was little room for delay. Actions carried visible consequences, and those consequences arrived without hesitation. Success was brief and fragile. Failure was clear and final. The clarity of this structure made arcade games readable even to those who had never played before. Another defining feature was repetition. Arcade games were not designed to be completed in a single continuous session. Instead, they encouraged short attempts that could be repeated many times. Each playthrough stood alone, yet was connected to the memory of previous attempts. Progress was not stored by the machine. It lived in the player's familiarity with patterns, timing, and space. This repetition created a distinctive rhythm. Early moments in a game were often manageable, even inviting. As time passed, conditions became tighter. Enemies moved faster, spaces became more crowded, margins for error narrowed. The game did not change its rules, but it revealed them more fully. What felt simple at first gradually demanded precision. Difficulty in arcade games was not hidden. It was visible, measurable, and consistent. Players could see how the challenge increased. They could anticipate moments of pressure, even if they could not always avoid them. This transparency made difficulty feel like part of the design, rather than an obstacle placed in the way. The game presented itself honestly, without promising safety or fairness beyond its own internal logic. Arcade games also relied heavily on constraint. Lives were limited. Time was restricted. Resources were scarce. These limits were not explained, but they were immediately felt. A single mistake could end a session. This did not create frustration alone. It created intensity. Knowing that opportunities were limited made each decision more deliberate. The structure of arcade games favored consistency over adaptation. The game did not adjust to the player's skill. Instead, the player adjusted to the game. Patterns repeated. Behaviors remained stable. Over time, familiarity replaced surprise. What once felt overwhelming became predictable, even calming, for those who stayed long enough to notice the underlying order. Visual design supported this structure. Arcade games used simple shapes, strong contrasts, and clear motion. Important elements stood out immediately. Danger was rarely ambiguous. Safety was rarely hidden. The screen communicated constantly, even when no text was present. A glance was often enough to understand the current state of play. This visual clarity was necessary in crowded environments. Arcade games were played in rooms filled with movement, sound, and distraction. Screens had to compete for attention without overwhelming the player. Designers relied on bold silhouettes, repeating motion, and consistent layouts. Once learned, these layouts became mental maps that guided movement without conscious thought. Sound played an equally important role. Audio cues provided information that the screen alone could not. A change in pitch could signal increasing danger. A short melody could confirm success. A sharp noise could announce failure. These sounds were functional before they were expressive. They told the player what had happened, often faster than visual feedback could. Arcade game sound was also designed to travel. It filled the room, not just the player's ears. This made each session partially public. Others could hear progress and setbacks without watching the screen. In this way, sound extended the game beyond its cabinet, making it part of the surrounding space. Another shared element across arcade games was their reliance on timing. Many games were built around cycles rather than randomness. Enemies moved in patterns. Hazards appeared at regular intervals. Safe moments and dangerous moments followed predictable sequences. Success depended on recognizing and adapting to these rhythms. Timing created a sense of flow. Players who moved in sync with the game appeared composed, even when the screen was busy. Those who rushed or hesitated at the wrong moments were quickly overwhelmed. The game did not reward speed alone. It rewarded alignment with its internal pace. Controls were designed to be immediately understandable. Joysticks, buttons, and directional inputs were limited in number and clear in function. There were rarely multiple ways to perform the same action. This simplicity reduced hesitation. Players did not need to search for options. They acted directly, responding to what they saw and heard. Despite this simplicity, depth emerged over time. Small adjustments in movement or timing could have large effects. A slight delay before pressing a button, a small shift in position, could determine the outcome of a session. This sensitivity made arcade games feel responsive and alive, even within their rigid structures. Scores provided a final layer of structure. They quantified performance without explaining it. A number increased or stopped. That was all. There was no commentary on why a score was high or low. Interpretation was left to the player. Over time, scores became benchmarks, both personal and shared. High score tables reinforced repetition. They suggested that improvement was possible, even if it was incremental. Seeing other scores implied unseen attempts, unseen failures, unseen learning. The table did not tell a story, but it hinted at one. Names or initials remained long after the player had gone, quietly inviting comparison. Arcade games rarely ended with resolution. There was no final scene, no clear conclusion. Sessions stopped because a limit had been reached, not because a narrative had finished. This open-endedness kept the focus on the act of playing rather than on an outcome. Each session was complete in itself, yet never final. Across different genres and themes, this structure remained remarkably consistent. Whether navigating enclosed spaces, defending against advancing threats, or reacting to falling obstacles, arcade games followed similar principles. Quick entry, clear rules, rising pressure, definite endings, immediate restarts. These shared traits allowed players to approach new arcade games with confidence. Even unfamiliar titles felt accessible. The learning curve was steep but visible. Within moments, players understood what was expected, even if they could not yet succeed. This balance between clarity and challenge defined the arcade experience. Over time, these patterns became so familiar that they felt natural. Players did not think about structure or design. They responded instinctively. The machine presented a situation. The player acted. The result was immediate. This loop repeated again and again, forming the core of arcade play. As arcades filled with machines following this shared logic, the environment became predictable in its own way. Each cabinet offered a variation on a known structure. Differences mattered, but the underlying rhythm remained. This consistency allowed arcade games to coexist side by side without confusion. By the time arcade games were widely recognized as a distinct form, their internal structure had already stabilized. The way they started, progressed, and ended was no longer questioned. These patterns defined expectations. They shaped how players approached each new machine. And yet, within this stability, subtle differences continued to emerge. Some games emphasized speed, others precision. Some crowded the screen quickly, others allowed space to breathe. These variations did not break the structure, they explored it. They tested how far it could stretch while remaining recognizable. As this exploration continued, attention slowly shifted, not away from the games themselves, but toward the experience of staying with them. toward what happened across repeated sessions, toward how familiarity changed perception, toward what remained constant and what revealed itself only over time. The structure of arcade games had been established. What followed was not a change in form, but a deepening of experience, unfolding gradually with each return to the screen. In some arcade games, pressure did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. The screen began with open space, room to think, room to move. Then, slowly, that space narrowed. Shapes descended, patterns repeated, and the margin for hesitation shrank. In Space Invaders, this tightening of space was visible from the first moments, turning time itself into a visible force that pressed steadily toward the player. Other games approach structure through enclosure rather than descent. Instead of the screen filling from above, the player moved within a closed system, tracing familiar paths again and again. In Pac-Man, the maze was not just a setting but a rule. Movement followed corridors, turns repeated, and escape depended on learning how space behaved over time, rather than reacting to a single threat. Some arcade designs emphasized repetition through return. Enemies did not simply disappear when avoided. They came back, often in slightly altered forms, testing recognition more than reaction. Galaga made this pattern clear by allowing formations to regroup and attack again, creating a loop where familiarity was as important as speed. In other cases, the structure was defined by interruption. Progress was repeatedly broken by moments that demanded precise action. A single misstep could undo several seconds of careful movement. Donkey Kong illustrated this clearly, placing obstacles in predictable paths that required timing rather than improvisation. The game did not change, but each attempt revealed its expectations more clearly. Across these variations, a shared logic remained. Arcade games rarely hid their intentions. Threats were visible. Boundaries were clear. When the game became difficult, it did so openly. This transparency allowed players to attribute outcomes to their actions rather than to chance, reinforcing the sense that improvement, however small, was possible. Another recurring feature was the absence of long-term accumulation. Power-ups, advantages, or progress rarely carried over between sessions. Each play began from the same starting point. This reset reinforced the idea that mastery lived outside the machine. Knowledge and familiarity stayed with the player, not the cabinet. Visual motion also followed consistent rules. Important elements moved in recognizable patterns, often repeating at fixed intervals. This predictability turned chaos into something readable. What looked overwhelming at first glance often resolved into cycles that could be anticipated and navigated with enough attention. Sound continued to mirror this structure. Audio cues aligned with visual events, reinforcing timing and consequence. A brief signal could announce danger before it fully appeared on screen. Another could confirm a successful action without requiring the player to look away from movement. Sound did not decorate the experience. It guided it. The pace of arcade games was carefully contained. Sessions were neither endless nor abrupt. They expanded and contracted within a narrow range, allowing intensity to rise without becoming exhausting. This balance kept the experience repeatable. Even in later titles built around direct confrontation, such as Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, matches remained brief, rules stayed fixed, and outcomes arrived quickly. The screen no longer filled with patterns or formations, but the underlying rhythm of pressure, decision, and restart remained unchanged. Together, these design choices formed a recognizable order. Different themes, characters, and mechanics pass through the same underlying structure. Whether facing advancing shapes, navigating enclosed spaces, or standing opposite another player, the basic expectations stayed consistent. Players could move from one cabinet to another without needing to relearn the fundamentals, sensing familiar rhythms beneath new surfaces. By the time these patterns were firmly established, arcade games no longer needed explanation. Their structure spoke for itself. What remained was not the novelty of the machine, but the quiet familiarity of returning to it again and again, knowing that while the rules would not change, the experience within them always could. Arcade games never explained themselves. They did not introduce their rules, describe their goals, or guide the player step by step. From the first moment, they assumed understanding would emerge through contact. A screen would appear, shapes would move, sounds would signal change, and meaning would form without instruction. This absence of explanation was not a limitation. It was a deliberate design language. In arcade games, information was not delivered through words. It was embedded in movement, color, sound, and repetition. The screen acted less like a page to be read and more like a surface to be interpreted. Players were not told what mattered. They were shown again and again until recognition replaced confusion. This approach relied on visual clarity above all else. Arcade screens were designed to be readable instantly, often from several steps away. Important elements stood out through contrast and position. Threats moved differently than safe objects. Rewards occupied predictable spaces. Nothing was hidden behind subtlety. Meaning needed to survive distraction, noise, and brief attention. Color played a central role in this silent language. Bright hues signaled urgency, danger, or opportunity. Muted tones suggested background or neutrality. Changes in color often marked shifts in state without needing confirmation. A flashing element demanded focus. A sudden change in palette warned that conditions had altered. These signals worked without cultural translation. Shapes carried meaning as well. Simple forms were favored over detail. Squares, circles, and repeating figures allowed immediate recognition. Complexity was avoided, not because it was impossible, but because it slowed understanding. Arcade games prioritized recognition over realism. A player needed to know what something was before appreciating how it looked. Movement reinforced this clarity. Objects rarely drifted aimlessly. They followed patterns, directions, and speeds that communicated intent. An enemy approaching directly signaled one kind of danger. An enemy moving in arcs or formations signaled another. Through motion alone, the game described relationships between elements on the screen. Repetition strengthened this language. Patterns repeated until they became familiar. What was unclear at first became readable through exposure. Arcade games trusted repetition as a teaching tool. They did not correct misunderstanding through text or prompts. They allowed the player to notice, adapt, and internalize. Sound extended this communication beyond the screen. Audio cues often arrived before visual confirmation. A rising tone could announce escalation. A brief sound could confirm success without interrupting motion. Failure was marked audibly as well, leaving no ambiguity about outcome. These sounds were functional, not decorative. Arcade sound design was intentionally simple. Melodies were short. Effects were distinct. Each sound had a purpose. In crowded environments, clarity mattered more than subtlety. A sound needed to be understood even when overheard, even when attention was divided. The language of sound mirrored the language of visuals, direct, consistent, unmistakable. Together, sound and image formed a unified system. One rarely contradicted the other. Visual danger was accompanied by audio warning. Success was confirmed both on screen and through sound. This redundancy reduced confusion. Meaning arrived through multiple channels at once, reinforcing comprehension without explanation. One of the most striking aspects of this design language was its independence from written language. Arcade games could be played without reading a single word. Instructions, if present at all, were minimal. The core experience relied entirely on perception. This allowed arcade games to travel easily across regions and cultures without modification. In games like Pac-Man, this approach became especially clear. The game never explained its rules. Yet within moments, players understood where danger existed, where safety could be found, and what constituted progress. Color, motion, and sound combined to create an intuitive map of meaning. Similarly, in Space Invaders, progression was communicated visually rather than verbally. The steady descent of shapes conveyed urgency. The shrinking space spoke louder than any message could. Without a single sentence, the game described its own trajectory. This silent language required discipline. Designers could not rely on explanation to compensate for unclear design. Every element needed to justify its presence. If something was confusing, it was redesigned, not described. This constraint sharpened the overall clarity of arcade games. The absence of text also shaped pacing. Without interruptions for reading or instruction, play remained continuous. Attention stayed anchored to the screen. Learning happened in motion, not in pause. This uninterrupted flow contributed to the distinctive intensity of arcade experiences. Arcade games also avoided ambiguity in outcomes. Success and failure were clearly marked. A session ended decisively. There was no uncertainty about whether an action had worked. This certainty reinforced trust in the system. The game communicated honestly, even when it was unforgiving. Another aspect of this language was consistency. Once a rule was established, it remained stable. Colors did not change meaning mid-game. Sounds did not contradict visual cues. Movement patterns remained reliable. This consistency allowed players to build understanding incrementally, without fear that learned meanings would suddenly invert. Over time, this design language became standardized. Players approached new arcade games with expectations shaped by previous experiences. Designers built upon these shared assumptions. This created a silent conversation between games, where understanding carried over without being explicitly acknowledged. Companies such as Namco became known for refining this approach. Their games emphasized clarity, rhythm, and immediate comprehension. Without labeling these choices, they contributed to a shared visual and auditory vocabulary that defined the era. Different regions emphasized different nuances within this language. In Japan, arcade games often leaned toward precision and flow, favoring readable density over chaos. In the United States, designs sometimes emphasized boldness and spectacle. Yet the underlying grammar remained compatible. A player familiar with one could understand the other. This universality was one of arcade gaming's quiet achievements. Without translation, without instruction, games communicated across borders. They relied on perception rather than interpretation. Meaning emerged from interaction, not explanation. As the number of arcade games grew, this silent language became increasingly refined. Unnecessary elements disappeared. What remained was efficient, expressive, and resilient. Arcade games learned how to speak with fewer and fewer symbols, trusting the player to listen. By the early 1980s, this design language had stabilized. It no longer needed to prove itself. Players recognized it instantly. Designers relied on it implicitly. Arcade games communicated who they were within seconds of being seen. This language did not draw attention to itself. It did not announce its rules. It simply functioned. Players stepped into it without ceremony, learned without instruction, and understood without being told. And once understood, it lingered. Even after stepping away from the machine, the patterns remained familiar. Colors, sounds, and movements echoed quietly in memory, ready to be recognized again. As arcade games continued to evolve, this silent language remained their foundation. New ideas would build upon it, stretch it, and reinterpret it. But the core principles stayed intact. Arcade games did not speak in words. They spoke in systems, and those systems were meant to be felt before they were understood. As arcade design matured, restraint became one of its most powerful tools. Designers learned that removing elements often communicated more than adding them. Empty space was not wasted space. It clarified intention. A clear path, an uncluttered screen, a single moving threat could say more than a crowded display filled with detail. Silence, visually and sonically, became part of the language. Negative space began to function as guidance. Areas without activity suggested safety, pause, or preparation. Active zones, by contrast, drew attention through motion and contrast. Without signs or markers, the screen itself organized behavior. Where nothing happened, nothing was required. Where something moved, meaning gathered. Consistency across screens also mattered. Many arcade games used repeating layouts, symmetrical designs, or mirrored patterns. This repetition was not decorative. It allowed players to predict behavior without conscious thought. Familiar shapes returning in familiar places reinforced understanding, making learning feel natural rather than instructional. Typography, when it appeared at all, was treated as part of the visual system rather than as language. Letters were blocky, readable, and minimal. They conveyed only what was essential: a score, a remaining attempt, a brief signal of status. Words never explained the game. They simply confirmed what the player already sensed. Animation timing played a subtle role in communication. Movements often accelerated or decelerated in meaningful ways. A brief pause before an action signaled importance. A sudden speed change signaled danger. These timing cues worked beneath awareness, guiding attention without interruption. In games like Galaga, the momentary stillness before an enemy broke formation carried as much meaning as the movement itself. The game spoke through anticipation. Players learned to read not just motion, but the absence of motion as part of the system. Color relationships also became standardized. Certain combinations were avoided because they reduced legibility. Others were favored because they separated foreground from background instantly. These choices were practical, but they also created a recognizable aesthetic. Arcade games looked like arcade games, even across different themes. This visual consistency extended across companies and regions. A player encountering a new cabinet could immediately recognize it as belonging to the same family of experiences. Without branding or explanation, the design language identified itself. The cabinet spoke before the game even began. Sound design followed similar principles of economy. Many games limited themselves to a small set of distinct tones. Each sound carried a specific meaning and was reused consistently. Over time, players learned to associate these sounds with outcomes, states, or transitions, often without consciously noticing the association. This economy of sound and image made arcade games resilient. They functioned in bright rooms and dim ones, in noisy spaces and quieter corners. Their messages survived distraction. Meaning was never fragile. It was reinforced through multiple simple signals working together. By relying on these shared conventions, arcade games created a kind of fluency that required no instruction. Understanding emerged through repetition, observation, and quiet familiarity rather than explanation. A player did not need to be told what mattered, because the system revealed it through consistency. Over time, this unspoken language became stable enough to be recognized instantly, even across different games and settings. What was learned in one place could be carried into another without conscious effort. Once this silent understanding existed, something subtle changed around the machines themselves. Meaning no longer lived only on the screen. It began to circulate in the space around it. People could stand nearby, watch briefly, and understand what was happening without being involved directly. The game spoke clearly enough that it did not need exclusive attention, and this openness quietly shaped how arcade games were experienced together, not just individually. Arcade games were never isolated objects. Even when a single person stood in front of a cabinet, the experience extended outward into the room. Screens faced the open space, not a wall. Sounds traveled freely. Movement on the display was visible from a distance. From the beginning, arcade games existed in a shared environment, and that environment quietly shaped how they were experienced. One of the most common scenes in an arcade was not someone playing, but someone watching. People paused briefly while passing through, letting their eyes follow motion on a screen before moving on. Others stayed longer, leaning slightly forward, hands in pockets, attention focused but unclaimed. Watching did not require permission. It was understood as part of the space. This ease of observation mattered. Arcade games did not hide their state. Progress, danger, and outcome were visible even to those unfamiliar with the game. A glance could reveal whether a player was doing well, struggling, or approaching an ending. Without commentary, the room absorbed these signals collectively. Over time, watching became a form of learning. New players rarely approached a cabinet without first seeing it played by someone else. They noticed routes, timing, and decisions without consciously naming them. When they eventually stepped forward, their hands already carried a sense of what might work. Knowledge passed silently, from screen to crowd, from crowd to player. Certain games made this dynamic especially clear. In side-scrolling action titles, motion flowed predictably across the screen, allowing even distant observers to follow along. In games like Metal Slug, action unfolded in a way that invited attention. Characters, enemies, and hazards were immediately recognizable, and the rhythm of progress was easy to read from afar. Watching felt almost participatory. Other games created a different kind of attention. Competitive titles drew crowds not through motion alone, but through confrontation. When two players faced each other directly, the surrounding space changed. The screen became a focal point. Silence often replaced chatter. In games such as Street Fighter II, matches were short, outcomes decisive, and stakes visible. Each round reset the room's tension, again and again. These moments established unspoken rules. Players waiting their turn stood close enough to signal interest, but far enough to avoid intrusion. Advice was rarely offered, unless asked for. Interruptions were frowned upon. Respect was shown through stillness. The arcade did not require signs to enforce this. The behavior sustained itself. Waiting itself became part of the experience. Coins placed on the cabinet edge quietly marked intention. A small stack of coins indicated popularity or challenge. This system required no explanation. Everyone understood what it meant to place a coin and what it meant to wait. Some games gathered attention through spectacle rather than competition. Racing cabinets, with their large screens and physical controls, acted as visual anchors in the room. In Outrun, the experience was readable, even to someone walking past. Speed, scenery, and sound communicated momentum instantly. Watching was enjoyable, even without understanding every mechanic. Larger cabinets amplified this effect. Wide displays and louder audio made certain games impossible to ignore. Daytona, USA often drew clusters of people who were not waiting to play at all. They stood nearby simply to watch progress unfold, sharing brief reactions without conversation. Not all social interaction was loud or obvious. In many arcades, the dominant tone was restraint. People stood close together without speaking. A nod might acknowledge a strong performance. A quiet step back signaled the end of a session. These gestures carried meaning precisely because they were minimal. High-score tables added another layer to this social structure. Scores remained long after players had left, turning individual effort into a visible trace. Names or initials became familiar, even if the people behind them were never met. Recognition existed without introduction. Reputation formed without conversation. This system encouraged a particular kind of persistence. Improvement was not announced, it was noticed. Someone who regularly appeared on the high-score table became known through consistency alone. The arcade rewarded visible commitment, not explanation. Importantly, this culture did not require uniform participation. Some people came to play briefly and leave. Others stayed for hours, circulating between cabinets, watching more than playing. The arcade accommodated both without judgment. Attention was fluid. Engagement rose and fell naturally. The physical layout of arcades supported this flow. Machines were positioned to allow movement between them. Sightlines overlapped, sounds blended. No single game dominated the space entirely. This arrangement allowed attention to drift, settle, and shift without friction. Regional differences added subtle variation. In Japanese arcades, spaces were often denser, stacked vertically, and quieter. Observation happened at close range, sometimes only inches from the screen. In American arcades, open layouts and louder environments encouraged broader visibility. Yet the underlying behaviors remained recognizable across contexts. Over time, regular visitors learned to read the room as much as the games. They sensed when to approach a cabinet, when to wait, and when to step aside. This awareness was not taught. It emerged through presence. The arcade trained no one explicitly, yet familiarity bred confidence. The social experience of arcade games also included moments of isolation within togetherness. A player deeply focused might tune out the surrounding room entirely. Yet even then, the possibility of being observed lingered. Performance existed whether or not attention was actively felt. This duality gave arcade play a distinctive tension. Players were alone with the machine, but never fully private. Every action was potentially visible. Every mistake might be noticed. This awareness sharpened focus without requiring self-consciousness. Some games thrived specifically because of this environment. Titles that were readable, dramatic, or rhythmically engaging benefited from being seen. Their design resonated outward, transforming individual input into shared experience. As arcades evolved, this social layer became inseparable from the games themselves. The meaning of a session extended beyond what happened on screen. It included who watched, who waited, and who remembered. By the time arcade culture was firmly established, these patterns felt natural. No one needed to explain how to behave. The space communicated its expectations quietly, just as the games did. Attention moved freely. Respect was assumed. Participation took many forms. And beneath all of this, the machines continued their steady cycles. Games began and ended. Scores appeared and vanished. Coins were placed and removed. The social order reset itself with each session, stable and flexible at the same time. As players came and went, the arcade maintained its rhythm, not through rules, but through shared understanding. What had begun as a collection of machines had become a place where watching mattered as much as playing, and where meaning existed not only on the screen, but in the space between people standing quietly around it. Recognition in arcades rarely arrived through names or introductions. It formed slowly, through repetition and presence. Regular visitors began to notice who appeared at certain hours, who stayed briefly, and who remained for long stretches of time. Familiarity grew without conversation, shaped by shared routines rather than personal exchange. Within this familiarity, a quiet hierarchy took shape. It was never announced or enforced. Some players became known for consistency, others for attempting difficult machines, others simply for how long they stayed without interruption. Respect accumulated through observation, not performance. It was felt rather than stated. High-score tables played a central role in this process. They did not explain who a player was, but they confirmed that someone had been there before. Initials became recognizable even when faces were not. A name appearing repeatedly suggested commitment, while a sudden entry near the top drew brief, silent attention. The placement of these tables mattered. Positioned at the end of a session or near the top of the screen, they created a pause after play. Players stepped aside, and the room absorbed the result. Others glanced instinctively, even if they were not waiting. The score did not ask for celebration. It asked to be noticed. Different arcades handled this visibility differently. In some spaces, high scores were central and brightly framed. In others, they were subtle, discovered only by those who looked closely. These choices shaped the atmosphere. Where scores were prominent, comparison felt immediate. Where they were subdued, recognition felt private. The same cabinet could feel entirely different, depending on its surroundings. In crowded arcades, a machine became a stage. Attention gathered naturally, and performance felt amplified. In quieter rooms, that same machine invited focus rather than display. The environment rewrote meaning without altering the game itself. Sound contributed to this shift. In loud arcades, audio blended into a constant hum, absorbing individual moments into a larger rhythm. In quieter spaces, every sound stood out. A single success or failure could briefly define the room. Players adjusted their presence without thinking, matching the tone around them. Waiting introduced another social layer. Standing near a cabinet without playing was not passive. It communicated interest. Distance carried meaning. Too close felt intrusive. Too far suggested uncertainty. Over time, people learned these distances instinctively, arranging themselves without discussion. These small adjustments turned bodies into signals within the space. Coins became symbols within this system. Placed on a cabinet, they marked sequence without words. A single coin meant next. Multiple coins meant patience. Removing a coin signaled withdrawal. This ritual worked because it was visible and accepted by everyone present. No explanation was ever needed for it to function. These small practices created a sense of fairness without enforcement. Disputes were rare. The order was clear, and the room itself observed it. Social pressure replaced rules, maintaining flow without authority. The system felt stable precisely because no one appeared to control it. Participation took many forms. Some people played, some waited, others lingered at the edges of the room. They leaned against walls, moved slowly between cabinets, or watched only certain moments. Their presence added to the feeling that the arcade was a place to inhabit, not merely a place to use. Being there did not require active involvement. This openness allowed intensity and detachment to coexist. Someone deeply focused on a game could stand beside someone casually observing without tension. Attention was never demanded. It was invited, allowed to drift and return. The space respected different levels of engagement, making it possible to be present without commitment and committed without display. In this way, the arcade never forced participation, yet rarely felt empty. Occasionally, moments of shared focus emerged. A long run, a close match, or a difficult section could draw eyes from across the room. These moments passed quickly, but left a trace. A brief silence, a subtle shift in posture, then a return to the steady rhythm. Collective attention appeared and dissolved without ceremony, leaving behind a quiet awareness that something had just happened. Over time, these patterns became inseparable from the games themselves. Playing could not be fully separated from watching, and waiting became art of learning. The arcade functioned less as a venue and more as a shared routine, where presence alone carried meaning and a social layer quietly completed the experience. What remained was not a crowd, but a rhythm people learned to move within, returning to it without planning and leaving without closure. Arcade games did not disappear suddenly. They did not collapse in a single moment, nor were they replaced overnight by something entirely new. Instead, they began to lose their central position slowly, almost quietly, as the conditions that once made them essential began to shift. What changed was not the desire to play, but where play was expected to happen. For many years, Arcade games existed because they offered something unavailable elsewhere. Specialized hardware, brighter screens, louder sound, and faster performance justified the journey to a specific place. Playing meant leaving home, standing in a shared room, and engaging with machines that felt distinct from everyday technology. This difference gave arcades their gravity. As technology advanced, that difference began to narrow. Screens became more common in homes. Processing power increased. Sound systems improved. The gap between what could be experienced in a public arcade and what could be accessed privately grew smaller with each passing year. Arcade games remained impressive, but they were no longer alone in that role. The rise of home gaming systems did not initially threaten arcades. Early home consoles offered simplified versions of arcade-style play, often with noticeable compromises. Shorter draw distances, reduced color palettes, and limited sound made the distinction clear. Arcades still represented the highest level of the experience. But this balance did not last indefinitely. By the late 1980s, home systems had begun to close that gap decisively. Visual fidelity improved. Controls became more responsive. Games grew longer and more complex. The living room started to offer experiences that felt complete rather than secondary. Play no longer required leaving home to feel substantial. Alongside these technological changes came a shift in how time was used. Arcade games were built around short sessions, designed to fit into brief intervals. Home games, by contrast, encouraged longer engagement. Progress could be saved. Stories could unfold over hours rather than minutes. The rhythm of play slowed and expanded. This change in rhythm mattered. Arcade games thrived on intensity and repetition. Home games introduced continuity and accumulation. Instead of beginning again with each session, players could resume where they left off. Effort carried forward. Time invested felt preserved. This altered the emotional structure of play. Economic factors also played a role. Operating an arcade required physical space, maintenance, electricity, and staffing. Each cabinet occupied a fixed area and depended on steady use to justify its presence. As foot traffic declined, sustaining that model became increasingly difficult. Home gaming, by contrast, required no shared space beyond what already existed. For players, the shift felt subtle at first. A visit to the arcade became less frequent, then occasional, then optional. The novelty of the space faded as similar experiences became accessible elsewhere. Arcades were not rejected. They were simply no longer necessary for most forms of play. Game design evolved alongside these changes. Developers began to imagine experiences that unfolded over time rather than repeating endlessly. Narrative, character development, and exploration became more prominent. These ideas fit naturally into home environments, where uninterrupted time was easier to secure. Arcade games, with their focus on immediacy and clarity, did not easily accommodate these new priorities. Their structure favored short loops and visible outcomes. While some experiments attempted to extend arcade experiences, the format itself resisted long-form engagement. The design logic that once made arcades powerful now limited their adaptability. Social habits shifted as well. Playing games at home allowed for privacy, comfort, and flexibility. Friends gathered in living rooms rather than public halls. The shared experience remained, but its setting changed. Interaction became more conversational, less observational. Watching someone play no longer required standing behind them in a crowded room. This did not eliminate the social dimension of gaming, but it transformed it. Communication became more direct. The quiet rituals of waiting, observing, and yielding space were replaced by verbal negotiation and shared screens. The atmosphere changed from public coexistence to private gathering. In some regions, these changes arrived faster than in others. In the United States, many arcades were closely tied to shopping centers and entertainment complexes. As consumer habits shifted and malls declined, these spaces lost their natural foot traffic. The arcade's position weakened alongside the environments that once supported it. In Japan, arcades remained visible for longer. Dense urban environments, efficient public transport, and different social rhythms allowed arcade culture to persist. Even there, however, its role evolved. Arcades became more specialized, catering to niche audiences rather than serving as universal gathering points. The early 1980s also brought moments of instability. Market saturation, uneven quality, and shifting consumer confidence created uncertainty. While these moments are often summarized as crisis, they were part of a broader realignment rather than a single failure. The industry did not end. It recalibrated. Importantly, arcade games did not lose relevance because they stopped being enjoyable. Their core appeal remained intact. What changed was the context in which enjoyment was sought. Convenience, continuity, and control over time became increasingly valuable. As home gaming grew, the idea of ownership gained importance. Players wanted to possess their games, revisit them freely, and explore them at their own pace. Arcade games, bound to specific locations and sessions, could not offer this sense of permanence. The cost structure of arcade play also shifted in perception. Individual sessions felt inexpensive, but accumulated cost became more noticeable when compared to a one-time purchase. Home games reframed value around duration rather than intensity. This reframing altered expectations. Developers followed audiences. Resources moved toward platforms that promised longer engagement and broader reach. Arcade development continued, but it was no longer the primary focus. The center of gravity shifted quietly, without ceremony. Arcades adapted where they could. Some leaned into spectacle. Others focused on experiences difficult to replicate at home. Still others specialized in competitive or rhythm-based games. These adaptations prolonged relevance, but they also signaled change. The arcade was becoming one option among many, rather than the default destination. For many players, the transition felt natural rather than disruptive. One habit replaced another. Visits became memories, then references. The arcade did not vanish from cultural awareness, but it stopped defining it. What remained was a sense of familiarity rather than necessity. Arcade games became something people returned to occasionally, not something they depended on. Their presence persisted, but their position shifted. This shift did not erase what arcades had built. The logic of short sessions, clear feedback, and immediate challenge influenced new forms of play. These ideas traveled into home gaming, mobile experiences, and later digital spaces. The arcade's influence continued, even as its physical spaces receded. By the time arcade games were no longer central, their role had already been fulfilled. They had introduced a way of engaging with interactive systems that emphasized clarity, intensity, and repetition. Other formats absorbed these lessons and expanded upon them. The arcade's withdrawal from the center was not a failure. It was a transition, a response to changing conditions rather than a loss of relevance. Arcade games stepped back not because they were outdated, but because the world around them had changed. As this shift settled, arcades found themselves in a quieter position, present but no longer dominant, recognized but not required. Their machines continued to glow, their sounds continued to echo, but their role had transformed. And in that transformation, arcade games became something different, not the main stage, but a reference point. Not the beginning of play, but a reminder of how play once organized itself around shared spaces, brief encounters, and moments of intense focus. This change did not close a chapter, it turned a page. What followed would not replace the arcade entirely, but would carry its influence forward into new environments, new habits, and new forms of attention, already waiting to be explored next. As arcades moved away from the center of everyday play, they did not vanish from the physical world. Instead, their presence became more selective, shaped by intention rather than visibility. Fewer locations carried greater weight, and those that remained were no longer expected to serve everyone. Arcades no longer needed to be everywhere. They needed to exist only where their particular rhythm still made sense, where short sessions and focused attention felt natural rather than outdated. One noticeable shift was scale. Large, general-purpose arcades gradually gave way to more specialized spaces that emphasized a narrower range of experiences. Some leaned toward competitive play, others toward rhythm and precision, others toward machines that resisted easy translation into home environments. This narrowing was not a retreat. It was a refinement, a recognition that breadth was no longer necessary for relevance. Arcade spaces also began to change how they presented themselves. Rather than blending seamlessly into shopping centers or transit areas, many became destinations in their own right. People no longer stumbled into arcades while passing through other activities. They chose to go. This act of choosing altered expectations, slowing the pace of visits and encouraging longer, more deliberate stays. Another adjustment involved maintenance and curation. When arcades were central, machines rotated frequently to maintain novelty. As arcades became less common, selection mattered more than turnover. Cabinets stayed longer, and familiarity shifted from being a risk to becoming a feature. Returning to the same machine was no longer a sign of stagnation, but part of the appeal. Economic pressure reshaped ownership models as well. In many regions, large chains gave way to independent operators who approached arcades with a different mindset. These operators focused less on volume and more on balance, treating arcades as spaces to be sustained rather than maximized. Longevity replaced expansion as the primary goal. The relationship between arcades and technology also evolved. Instead of competing with rapid hardware advances, many spaces leaned into durability and preservation. Machines were repaired, restored, and kept running well beyond their expected lifespan. The arcade became a place where time layered rather than reset, where different eras could coexist without conflict. Audience behavior adjusted accordingly. Visitors moved more slowly, spending time observing as much as playing. Conversations were quieter, transitions between machines less hurried. The urgency that once defined arcade visits softened. Intensity remained concentrated on the screen, but the surrounding space grew calmer and more reflective. This calmer atmosphere allowed arcades to coexist with other forms of entertainment rather than compete directly against them. Some shared space with cafes or bars, others aligned with events, tournaments, or themed evenings. The arcade adapted to contemporary schedules and habits instead of demanding constant, uninterrupted attention. Importantly, this transition preserved the core identity of arcade games themselves. Short sessions, clear outcomes, and immediate feedback remained unchanged. What shifted was context rather than content. Arcade games were no longer the default way to play, but a distinct way to play, defined by contrast rather than dominance. By stepping out of the center, arcades avoided dilution. They no longer needed to accommodate every type of player or every style of game. Instead, they served those who actively sought their specific cadence. This selectivity gave arcade spaces a quieter resilience, allowing them to persist without pressure to expand. As a result, arcade games did not fade into obscurity. They settled into a stable position, neither dominant nor obsolete, no longer defining everyday play, but no longer removed from it either. Their presence became deliberate, their spaces intentional, shaped by choice rather than necessity. In stepping back from the center, arcades loosened their dependence on constant attention and mass appeal. This distance allowed their core ideas to separate from their physical spaces, carrying forward the logic of short sessions, clarity, and immediacy into other environments. What remained was not just a place to visit, but a way of thinking about interaction, ready to surface quietly in new forms and unfamiliar contexts. Arcade games were never visually uniform. From the very beginning, they experimented with different ways of drawing motion, space, and interaction onto a screen. What connected them was not a single aesthetic, but a shared need to communicate quickly, clearly, and without explanation. Over time, several visual approaches emerged, coexisted, and sometimes competed with one another, each shaped by the technological and practical limits of its moment. Among the earliest arcade games, some avoided pixels almost entirely. Vector-based displays drew images using lines rather than grids, creating sharp shapes that floated against dark backgrounds. These games looked precise, almost mathematical. Movement was smooth, angles were clean, and the screen felt spacious. There was no visible grain, no blocky texture. The image appeared closer to a technical drawing than a picture. Vector graphics solved certain problems elegantly. Lines could be scaled without distortion. Motion felt fluid even at lower refresh rates. In dark rooms, the contrast was striking. These games communicated geometry and direction exceptionally well. For a time, this approach felt futuristic, as if it belonged to a different branch of visual language altogether. At the same time, most arcade games followed a different path. They relied on raster displays, building images from small square units arranged in grids. These units, later called pixels, were not chosen for their beauty. They were chosen because they were manageable. Hardware could address them reliably. Memory could store them efficiently. Developers could control them precisely. As a result, pixel-based graphics became widespread not because they were ideal, but because they were workable. They allowed designers to place shapes exactly where needed, update them quickly, and repeat patterns consistently. What began as a technical compromise gradually turned into a visual system with its own logic and strengths. Pixel graphics excelled at one thing above all others: legibility. In busy environments filled with noise, movement, and distraction, pixel images held together. Shapes remained recognizable even at small sizes. Motion could be exaggerated without becoming unclear. Color blocks stood out against simple backgrounds. Meaning survived distance and interruption. This legibility mattered more than realism. Arcade games were rarely viewed up close in quiet isolation. They were seen from several angles, from across rooms, sometimes only for a moment. A player needed to understand what was happening instantly. A passerby needed to recognize danger or success without context. Pixel graphics supported this requirement naturally. As arcade technology advanced, new possibilities appeared. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, three-dimensional and pseudo-three-dimensional graphics entered arcade spaces. Polygons replaced sprites. Perspective suggested depth. Roads curved into the distance. Objects scaled as they moved closer or farther away. These games offered sensations that pixels alone could not provide. Importantly, this association does not deny the existence or value of other visual approaches. It simply acknowledges how memory works. The mind selects what can be easily stored, easily recognized, and easily shared. Pixel graphics met these conditions quietly and persistently. Today, when people think of arcade games, they often picture pixelated screens, even if they once played vector-based or 3D titles. This is not a historical error. It is a compression. The memory has simplified the experience into its most durable form. This durability explains why pixel aesthetics continue to appear in modern contexts that reference arcade logic. Designers reach for pixels not to imitate the past, but to access a visual language that communicates immediately. Pixels still signal clarity, constraint, and directness. They still speak without explanation. At the same time, the persistence of pixel imagery does not trap arcade ideas in the past. Instead, it frees them from dependence on specific technologies. The arcade becomes recognizable as a way of structuring attention rather than as a fixed visual style. Pixels are remembered because they were effective, not because they were first. Vector graphics and 3D arcade visuals remain important chapters in this history. They demonstrate that arcade design was always experimental, responsive, and adaptive. But memory does not archive every experiment equally. It preserves what integrates most smoothly with perception. What remains, then, is not a single look, but a hierarchy of recall. Pixel graphics sit at the top not by accident, but by alignment. They aligned with how arcades were used, how they were seen, and how they were remembered. This alignment becomes especially clear when arcade ideas move beyond their original spaces. When designers want to evoke immediacy, simplicity, and readable challenge, pixels appear naturally. They do not require explanation. They arrive already understood. In this sense, pixel graphics are not a nostalgic residue. They are a visual solution that continues to function. They outlasted other approaches because they were less dependent on progress and more dependent on perception. Arcade games were never only pixel-based. They explored lines, depth, and simulated space with confidence. But pixels became the shape people remembered, because pixels were the shape that carried meaning most efficiently from screen to memory. As this understanding settles, the arcade reveals something important about design itself. What endures is not always what is most advanced, but what is most legible. Not what impresses briefly, but what remains coherent over time. This realization prepares the ground for the final step. If pixel aesthetics and arcade logic still resonate, and if memory continues to recognize them instinctively, then the question becomes not whether arcades survived, but where they can still be found, physically and deliberately, in the present world. That question waits just ahead. Arcade games did not retreat into memory alone. They remained present in the world, but in fewer places, chosen more carefully. Today, arcades are no longer encountered by accident. They are visited with intention, approached as destinations rather than interruptions. This shift changed not only where arcades exist, but how they are understood. In Japan, large arcade spaces never fully disappeared. Multi-floor buildings still glow in dense city centers, drawing people upward through layers of sound and light. Places like Taito Station continue to operate not as remnants, but as active parts of urban life, adapting without abandoning their core rhythm. Other Japanese arcades evolved under different names, but similar logic. GIGO, once associated with a different era of branding, now functions as a modern expression of the same idea. These spaces remain large, vertical, and focused, emphasizing presence rather than novelty. Some venues expanded the concept further. Round 1 combines arcade games with other shared activities, extending the stay without diluting the experience. The arcade becomes part of a longer visit, integrated rather than isolated, while still preserving its distinctive cadence. In the United States, arcades followed a different path. Many became archival rather than ubiquitous. Galloping Ghost Arcade stands as an example of scale through preservation, offering an environment where machines are not replaced quickly, but kept accessible, functional, and visible. These places do not try to recreate the past exactly. They do not claim to restore an era. Instead, they acknowledge that arcade games now serve a different role. They are no longer the default setting for play, but a specific one, chosen for what it offers that other spaces do not. What these arcades share is not size or location, but atmosphere. Screens are still public, positioned to be seen rather than hidden. Sound still travels freely, overlapping instead of isolating. Watching still matters, not as a secondary activity, but as part of the experience itself. The arcade remains an open environment, where play unfolds in view of others, shared rather than enclosed, present rather than private. Even now, the arcade asks people to stand, observe, wait, and engage briefly, without demanding long-term commitment or uninterrupted focus. This physical openness explains why arcade spaces continue to feel meaningful. They offer a form of presence that has become increasingly rare. Attention is visible rather than abstract. Engagement can be noticed without being announced. Participation does not require instruction, accounts, or preparation. A person can enter, understand what is happening within moments, and leave without friction, carrying the experience lightly rather than accumulating it. Within these spaces, the visual language discussed earlier continues to function with quiet efficiency. Pixel graphics remain prominent, not because they are fashionable or intentionally retro, but because they remain effective. From a distance, pixel shapes hold together. Across a room, silhouettes remain readable. In noisy environments, strong color blocks resist confusion. In crowded conditions, clarity matters more than detail, and pixels continue to deliver that clarity reliably. Vector graphics and three-dimensional visuals still appear, but they rarely define the space as a whole. They function as accents, moments of contrast rather than structural anchors. Their impact often depends on proximity, scale, or novelty. Pixel imagery, by contrast, organizes attention consistently. It survives changes in lighting, viewing angle, and familiarity without losing its communicative strength. It does not ask to be admired up close in order to be understood. This persistence ties the present directly to the past without imitation. The pixel is not preserved as a symbol of nostalgia or as a reference to history. It remains because it never stopped being useful. From the beginning, it solved a specific problem: how to communicate action, danger, and outcome quickly, quietly, and to many people at once, without explanation. That problem still exists, and the pixel still answers it with the same clarity. Because of this, the arcade never depended on being the most advanced form of play. It depended on being immediately understood. While other visual systems chased realism or scale, the arcade focused on legibility. What mattered was not how much could be shown, but how clearly something could be seen. This focus shaped an experience that did not age in the same way technology does. Seen this way, arcade games did not survive by reclaiming prominence or attempting to dominate again. They survived by remaining understandable. Their spaces became fewer and more selective, but their internal logic stayed intact. Wherever attention gathers briefly, where clarity is valued over accumulation, and where play is shared rather than enclosed, the arcade is still present, not everywhere, but exactly where it makes sense. This presence does not ask for commitment. It does not ask to be followed, saved, or completed. It offers a moment that begins cleanly and ends cleanly. You step in, you understand, you act, and you step away. Nothing is carried forward, and nothing is lost. The experience remains whole precisely because it is brief. In a world increasingly built around endless progress and constant accumulation, this completeness feels distinct. Arcade play does not promise more later. It delivers something now. That honesty creates a different relationship with time, one where attention is focused but not consumed, and engagement is intense but not demanding. The moment is allowed to end without leaving a trace that needs to be managed or returned to. This is why arcades still feel natural when encountered today. They do not interrupt modern life. They fit between things. They exist comfortably alongside movement, noise, and distraction, offering moments of focus without insisting on permanence. In this way, they respect the fragmented nature of contemporary attention rather than resisting it. In the end, the arcade was never defined by its machines alone. It was defined by a way of shaping attention, space, and time. This approach favored clarity over abundance, presence over permanence, and shared focus over private accumulation. What mattered was not how much could be stored or continued, but how completely a moment could be experienced before it ended. When the centers changed, this way of thinking did not disappear. It dispersed. It remained visible in pixels, in shared screens, and in experiences that still choose immediacy over excess. And because that clarity continues to matter, the arcade does not feel like something unfinished or left behind. It feels complete, settled into a form that no longer needs to prove itself.